A military K-9 that had charged through live fire, survived 3 combat deployments, and taken a bullet for his handler. That dog took one look at the waitress and pressed himself against her legs like a frightened puppy. The entire diner went dead silent. Coffee cups stopped halfway to mouths. Forks hovered over plates. A child in the corner booth stopped crying. Even the cook leaned out from the pass-through window, dish towel forgotten in his hand, staring at the sight of a 90-pound German shepherd, a dog that had once pinned an armed insurgent to the ground and held him there for 11 minutes, trembling against the legs of a woman in a pale blue uniform who smelled like antiseptic and pancake syrup. Colonel Damon Holt stood frozen in the middle of Harbor Light Diner, his chest full of ribbons and his face full of something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Confusion. The woman hadn't done anything. She'd just walked over with a coffee pot. And now his dog, his decorated, battle-hardened, fearless military working dog, was acting like she was the only safe thing in the room. The woman looked down at the dog. Then she looked up at Damon. Her expression was calm, not nervous, not surprised, just quiet. "What did you do to my dog?" Damon asked. She answered without missing a beat. "Nothing. He just remembers who never left him behind." Hosem. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're not alone. Follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The town of Merritt Cove sat at the edge of a narrow bay on the northeastern coast, the kind of place where fishing boats still outnumbered pleasure crafts, and the main street ran exactly 4 blocks before it dead-ended at the water. The Harbor Light Diner had been there since before most residents could remember, occupying the ground floor of a converted cannery building with wide plank floors and windows that fogged every morning from October through April. It was the kind of diner that knew everyone's order before they sat down, the kind of place where a stranger stood out immediately. Colonel Damon Holt had pulled into the parking lot at 7:43 that Tuesday morning in a rental vehicle because his personal truck was still in a DOD facility in Virginia, and he hadn't bothered to arrange transport before driving north. He'd taken leave, mandatory leave, his commanding officer had said, with a look that suggested the word mandatory was doing significant work in that sentence, and he'd pointed himself toward the coast without a clear destination in mind. Merritt Cove was just where he'd stopped. He climbed out wearing civilian clothes that still looked military somehow, dark jeans pressed sharp enough to cut, a charcoal pullover with the sleeves pushed to the elbows. His posture was the posture of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him, and he'd stopped noticing it years ago. Axel rode in the back seat in his travel harness, trained to wait for the release command before exiting any vehicle. Damon unclipped him at the rear door, and the dog dropped to the asphalt and stood perfectly still, scanning the parking lot with the same systematic sweep he'd used in 3 separate combat theaters. He was 7 years old, past the peak operational age for a working dog, and Damon had fought a month-long bureaucratic war to keep him out of the adoption queue and off any transition list. Axel wasn't a tool that got recycled. He was his dog. They walked into the diner together, the hostess at the front, a teenager with a ponytail and an expression that suggested she hadn't fully committed to being awake yet, looked up at the dog and started to speak. "We allow service animals," Damon said before she got the words out. It wasn't a question. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of fact that happened to be delivered to another person's face. The girl blinked. "Okay, booth or counter?" "Booth. Far wall." He settled in with his back to the wall and a clear line to the door, old habit, one he'd stopped trying to break. And Axel folded himself under the table and lay still. Most people in the diner had looked up when they walked in. A few kept looking. Damon didn't acknowledge any of them. The menu was laminated and slightly sticky. He set it aside and scanned the room instead, which was what he always did. Table of older men near the window, coffee drinkers, locals from the look of them. They'd been mid-conversation when Damon walked in and resumed it within 30 seconds, which meant they weren't easily impressed. Family with 2 young kids in the far corner, one child negotiating aggressively over something on the plate. A couple near the door who hadn't spoken in several minutes, reading separate sections of the same newspaper. And behind the counter, a waitress who moved with quiet efficiency that was somehow distinct from everyone else in the room. She wasn't the only server on the floor. There was a younger woman, early 20s, working the front tables with the slightly frantic energy of someone who had too many sections and not enough time. The one behind the counter was different. She was in her mid-30s, white, with dark hair pulled back simply, wearing the same pale blue uniform as the rest of the staff. She moved between the coffee station and the pass-through window without wasted motion, like she'd run the exact sequence 1,000 times and stripped everything unnecessary out of it. She wasn't remarkable, which was exactly the kind of person Damon had trained himself to notice. The younger waitress appeared at his table. "Hi there, can I start you with some coffee?" "Sure." "And the dog is—" "He's very handsome." "He's working," Damon said, which was not entirely true anymore, but close enough. The girl retreated slightly and went to get coffee. A few minutes later, the woman from behind the counter came to check on the adjacent table, an older gentleman who'd apparently ordered something that hadn't arrived. Damon heard her apologize quietly. Kitchen backed up, the eggs would be out shortly, she'd bring him toast in the meantime, and the old man deflated from irritated back to pleasant without her doing anything dramatic. She just listened and made him feel like the inconvenience was manageable. Then she refilled his water glass without being asked and moved toward the counter. She was passing Damon's table when Axel moved. Not aggressively, not the way he moved when threat-trained. He came out from under the table and stepped toward her, and when she noticed him and paused, the natural pause of someone seeing a large dog appear at close range, he pressed himself against the side of her legs and dropped his head. Damon was on his feet in less than a second. "Axel." "Higher." The dog didn't move. "Axel." The dog stayed where he was. The woman looked down at him. She didn't recoil, didn't reach to pet him, didn't make the sounds people made when they treated dogs like stuffed animals. She just looked at him with an expression that was very difficult to read. "Ma'am, take a step back from the dog." Damon kept his voice level, but the command structure was there. He used the same tone for subordinates who'd made a mistake and needed correction without escalation. She looked up at him. "He's not going to bite me." "You don't know that." "He came to me." The diner had gone quiet. Not completely. Silverware still clinked somewhere in the background, the coffee machine still gurgled, but the ambient noise had dropped, and the people nearest to them had stopped pretending not to watch. "That dog has cleared buildings and tracked armed combatants," Damon said, lowering his voice slightly. "He doesn't press up against strangers. Step away." She held his gaze for a moment. He had a full colonel's rank and a room full of service records behind his eyes, and she looked back at him with the steady patience of someone who had seen a lot of men who thought certainty was the same thing as authority. Then she said it. "Nothing. He just remembers who never left him behind." Damon stared at her. She handed her coffee pot to the girl behind her. The younger waitress had appeared at some point and was watching wide-eyed, and she crouched down next to Axel, slowly, and let the dog push his nose into her hand. He made a sound Damon had never heard from him. A low, exhaled whimper that sounded less like distress and more like recognition. "What did you just say to me?" Damon asked. She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the dog. Her hand moved to the base of his jaw, the specific pressure point that handlers use to calm working dogs mid-operation, and Axel's whole body seemed to loosen. "I said he remembers." She stood. She was looking at him again. "That's all." "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "The jaw pressure. That's a K9 field calming technique. That's not something a civilian knows." Something moved across her face. Not fear exactly. Something more controlled. "I've worked around dogs before." "Not like that you haven't." The older man at the adjacent table cleared his throat softly, the way people did when they were trying to be invisible. Damon clocked it without looking. He was aware of the room, aware of the audience, but he was locked onto her now with the same focused attention he brought to intelligence briefings and mission planning sessions, because something was wrong here, wrong in a way that didn't have a shape yet but was developing one. "What's your name?" he asked. She picked up her coffee pot from the counter beside her. "I'm your waitress. What can I get you?" "That's not what I asked." "It's what I answered." She topped off the coffee in the older man's cup without breaking eye contact with Damon. "Eggs and toast in 2 minutes," she told the old man and walked back toward the counter. Damon stood in the middle of the diner and watched her go. Axel returned to his side. The dog sat and looked up at him with an expression that Damon had always privately interpreted as, Now, do you see what I mean? He sat back down. The younger waitress appeared at his elbow with visible anxiety. Can I take your order? The full breakfast is really good. We have just coffee. He didn't look at her. He was watching the dark-haired woman behind the counter. And whatever her name is, the girl hesitated. Emily Voss. She's been here like 2 years. She's really nice. She didn't mean anything by, thank you, Damon said. He stayed for 40 minutes, long enough to drink 2 cups of coffee, eat a short stack he hadn't ordered but didn't send back, and watch Emily Voss work the morning rush. She was good at it. Not in the way people were good at things they'd practiced until they were comfortable. She was good at it the way people were good at things they'd disciplined themselves to become competent in, which was a different quality entirely. There was nothing effortless about it. It was controlled. Every movement was controlled. She didn't come back to his table. When he went to the register to pay, a different woman rang him up, and Emily Voss was in the kitchen. He left the right amount plus 12% and walked out. In the parking lot, he stood by the car for a moment with Axel beside him and thought about the jaw pressure technique, thought about the way the dog had reacted, thought about what she'd said. He just remembers who never left him behind. He opened the car door. "Where did you serve?" he said to the air, to no one, because she wasn't there. He drove to the motel 2 blocks south and checked in and sat on the edge of the bed with his laptop open, and he started making calls. The first call was to a contact at the DoD personnel office, a man named Greaves, who owed Damon a favor from 3 years prior that they'd never discussed and never would. Voss, Emily. Last name spelling Voss. Look for anything civilian, medical, nursing licenses, military adjacent. He paused. And check the K-9 program rosters, handler records, and attached medical personnel. 10, 12 years back. Greaves came back 17 minutes later. Nothing civilian on the nursing licenses under that name in this state, Colonel. Running adjacent programs now. A pause. Another pause. Longer. Huh. What? The K-9 medical rosters I can access are coming back restricted on anything past 8 years. Restricted how? Agency level flag. Not my clearance, not yours either, sir, if I'm reading this right. Greaves sounded slightly uncomfortable. Whatever's behind that flag, it's not standard operational security. That's a different kind of lock. Damon was quiet for a moment. Runner name against casualty lists, any official record at all, discharge papers, medical transfers, commendations. Give me a few minutes. He gave him 10. I'm getting nothing, Colonel. And I mean nothing. No service record, no discharge, no medical separation. If Emily Voss served in any capacity connected to these programs, she doesn't exist in any system I can reach. Greaves. Sir. What kind of operation scrubs someone that thoroughly? The pause that followed was the kind that meant the other man was choosing his words very carefully. The kind, Greaves finally said, that has something to protect. He should have left it there. He'd been on mandatory leave for exactly 7 days, ordered off base by a commanding officer who'd looked at him with the patient exhaustion of a man managing a resource that was valuable but increasingly difficult. Damon had been working 16-hour days for 11 months. He'd missed 2 medical evaluations. He'd been involved in a situation in Kazan province that was still being reviewed by 3 separate oversight bodies, and his CO had said, gently, but with great finality, "Take 4 weeks, Damon. Get out of the building. Come back human." He was not, at this moment, behaving in a manner consistent with that directive. But he went back to the diner the next morning anyway. Emily wasn't on the morning shift. He drank coffee and made conversation with the younger waitress. Kayla, her name was. She talked a lot when she was nervous, and learned that Emily worked Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings, and Thursday evenings. It was Wednesday. He went back at lunch. Emily was on the floor. She noticed him when he came in. He saw it, the slight pause, the recalibration, and she assigned him to Kayla's section without any visible communication. He watched her work. He watched how she moved through the kitchen pass and back, how she positioned herself in a room, how she was always slightly angled toward the exits. He'd been in enough operational briefings to recognize threat assessment behavior when he saw it. She was scanning every time a new person walked in, Not obviously. You'd have to be trained to see it, and Damon was very trained. But she was cataloging who came in, where they sat, whether they looked at her. After the lunch rush, when only a few tables remained occupied, she came to his table directly. "You've been in here twice in 2 days," she said, and set down a water glass he hadn't asked for. "Good coffee. There's a coffee shop on Anchor Street with better coffee." "I know. I tried it this morning." He looked up at her. "I'm Damon Holt." "I know who you are." She said it evenly, without drama. "Kayla told me. She also said you asked what days I work, which I'm going to assume was an accident. I ran your name through some databases." She went very still. Not the kind of still that was shock or fear performing itself loudly. The kind that was immediate, total, trained suppression, like someone who'd had a lot of practice controlling their first reaction and had gotten very good at it. "Did you?" she said. "Nothing came back." "I'm a waitress in a small town. Why would anything come back?" "That's the thing." He watched her. "Nothing came back because the records have been scrubbed, not because they were never there." The lunch crowd noise moved around them. Someone 2 tables over asked for the check. A kid knocked a juice glass, and it didn't break, and his mother made the exhale of relief. Emily picked up the water glass she'd just set down, held it for a moment, set it back down. "You should finish your leave in peace, Colonel," she said. "Merritt Cove is a nice town. Walk on the beach. The breakwater's good this time of year." She walked away. He left a 20 and didn't wait for change. So that night, he followed her. It wasn't his best judgment, and he knew that while he was doing it. But he'd spent enough years trusting his instincts to justify one more instance of it, even on mandatory leave, even in a coastal town where the biggest visible security concern was tourists ignoring the riptide warning signs. She finished her shift at 7 and walked out the back, cutting through the parking lot and heading south on Harbor Street toward the residential blocks. The route was quick and certain. She'd walked it before, and she moved without hesitation even in the dim, the way people moved when they knew exactly where they were going and weren't afraid to get there. He stayed half a block back. Axel was on lead beside him, because a man walking a dog at dusk looked like a man walking a dog at dusk. She turned left on Cove Lane, then cut through a narrow alley between 2 buildings that probably knocked 2 minutes off the walk. He followed. The alley was dark. One working streetlight at each end, nothing in the middle, the kind of urban shortcut that residents used and visitors didn't know existed. He was almost through when he heard it. Movement ahead, multiple sources. He stopped. 2 men stepped out from a doorway recess ahead of Emily. She stopped walking. The gap between them was maybe 12 feet. Damon's hand moved toward a weapon he wasn't carrying because civilians on mandatory leave in coastal Maine didn't carry sidearms, and he registered that absence the same moment he registered the situation. 2 men blocking her path, no good reason to be standing in a dark alley at 7:15 p.m. He started moving forward, pulling out his phone to call. Emily moved first. The first man reached for her. She caught his wrist with both hands and turned it in a direction a wrist wasn't built to go, and he went down with a sound like a man trying very hard not to scream. She released him before he fully hit the ground, pivoted, and the second man, who was already in motion, already committing to a grab, walked directly into an elbow that she planted in his sternum with the kind of mechanical precision that wasn't self-defense class precision or gym precision. That was close-quarters training precision. The second man folded. She stepped around him without looking down. Both men were on the alley floor. Neither was unconscious. They were processing what had happened, which was taking some time. Emily hadn't even dropped the canvas bag over her shoulder. She looked at Damon. "Following people is illegal," she said. Her breathing was normal. She wasn't winded at all. "I was walking my dog." "Your dog," she said, "has been staring at those 2 men since before they stepped out of the doorway. He knew they were there, which means you knew they were there, which means you weren't walking him." Damon looked at Axel, who was in fact staring at the 2 men on the ground with patient professional interest. "Who are they?" Damon asked. She was looking at them too now. Her expression had shifted, something working behind her eyes. "I don't know them. But you expected something like this." She didn't answer. "Emily, who are they?" She crouched and picked up the phone that had fallen from the closer man's jacket. She looked at it without touching the screen, reading the exterior, and her jaw tightened slightly. She set it back on the ground beside him. "You need to go back to your motel," she said. "I'm not leaving you here with... They're not a threat anymore tonight." She straightened. "Whoever sent them already knows they failed. They won't send more until they regroup, and regroup takes time. Go back to your motel, Colonel. And in the morning, drive south. Leave this town." She started walking. He walked with her. She didn't tell him to stop again. Bappo. They ended up at a park bench at the end of Harbor Street, overlooking the water, because she needed to think, and apparently the water helped her do that. And he needed her to talk, and apparently persistence was what it took to get there. She sat with the canvas bag in her lap. He sat at the other end of the bench. Axel lay between them with his head on his paws, watching the dark water. "I was a trauma nurse," she said, after 4 minutes of silence. She said it flat, like reading a line from a document she'd memorized long ago. "Military, attached to a classified unit. I'm not going to give you the designation, and you won't find it anyway, because the unit doesn't have a public existence. We handled casualties from operations that didn't officially happen. We treated operators, support personnel." She paused. "And we treated the dogs." Damon didn't say anything. "We were a tight team, 6 of us. We ran out of a facility in 3 different countries over 4 years. It was hard work, and it mattered, and we were good at it." She was looking at the water. 2 years before my service contract ended, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Documentation of a covert operation that had gone wrong. Not wrong by accident, but wrong by design. People had died, civilians had died, and the mission records had been falsified to cover the cause. And there was money moving, not operational budget money, the other kind. Embezzlement? Embezzlement, weapons diversion, and something else I still don't fully understand. Someone very high up was running a secondary operation underneath the official one, using classified mission infrastructure. We were treating casualties from missions we didn't know the real purpose of. Her voice stayed level throughout. "I documented what I found. I was in the process of routing it to proper oversight when our facility had an accident." He waited. "Structural fire. 1 building, total loss. The official record says we lost 3 people and the rest evacuated. The actual number is different. My team." She stopped. "They were contained in the building. The evacuation route was blocked. I wasn't there that night. I'd been sent to an off-site transfer, which I later understood was deliberate. I was the only one who knew what I'd found, and the only one whose death couldn't be arranged quietly without raising too many questions." "So you ran?" "I disappeared, which is different." She looked at him for the first time in several minutes. "My records were wiped, not by me, by whoever was trying to contain the situation, which worked in my favor eventually because it meant there was no active search under my real name. I built something new, stayed small, stayed quiet." She looked back at the water. "I've been in Merritt Cove for 2 years. This was supposed to be a long enough stop to look like settlement." "Was supposed to be," Damon said. "And then I walked into the diner." She exhaled through her nose. "And then you walked into the diner with Axel." He looked at the dog. "You treated him." "His unit rotated through our facility twice. He had a shrapnel wound in his left rear haunch after a breach operation, 2nd rotation. I removed the fragments. He was in my care for 11 days. She glanced down at the dog. "Dogs don't forget. Neither do handlers." He looked at her. "I've been trying to place where I'd seen that jaw technique used. I saw it in a field debrief video from a classified medical unit about 7 years ago. The medic on camera moved exactly the way you did in the diner." She was quiet. "Was it you?" he asked. "What happens to the information if I say yes?" "I don't know yet." At least he was honest about it. She seemed to weigh that. "Yes," she said. He leaned forward and put his elbows on his knees. Out on the water, a channel buoy was blinking its slow red rhythm. The night smelled like salt and cold air and low tide, and the bench was damp. "Those men in the alley," he said. "They weren't random." "No." "Someone sent them." "Yes." "Someone who knew you were here." She turned to look at him, and her expression was the specific expression of a person working out a sequence of events they hadn't fully assembled before this moment. Someone who knew I was here, she repeated, who didn't know until recently. He saw where she was going before she said it. My inquiry, he said. The database search. Greaves ran your name through the K9 medical rosters and hit a restricted flag. Her voice had dropped slightly, which flagged someone's alert system, which is how they found me. She looked at him steadily. You didn't find anything on me, Colonel, but the search itself told someone I existed. The channel buoy blinked. Axel lifted his head from his paws. In the distance, a car was moving slowly along Harbor Street, not toward the water, away from it, and its headlights swept the empty road in a pattern that didn't match a civilian driver looking for parking. Emily stood up from the bench. We can't stay here, she said. Damon was on his feet before she finished the sentence. The car had slowed to nearly a stop at the far end of Harbor Street. No reason to do that. No parking on that block, no cross-traffic to wait for, no delivery to make at 8 in the evening. Just a vehicle sitting in the dark with its engine running and its headlights pointed at nothing in particular. Walk, Emily said. Not fast, same pace. They moved off the bench and turned away from the water, heading inland along the side street that ran parallel to the alley. Axel matched their pace without instruction, which was something Damon had always appreciated about him. The dog read a situation and adapted without needing to be managed through it. How many exits from your apartment? Damon asked. It's a rental above a hardware store. Front stairs, fire escape off the kitchen window. The fire escape lets out on a service lane. Anything stored there you can't replace? She was quiet for a half second. A drive. Encrypted. Hidden in the wall behind the radiator. Then we go there first. If they know where I live, they know you exist. They don't know what you have. He kept his voice low, his eyes moving. There's a difference. If they wanted to burn the apartment, they would have done it before sending people to the alley. They want you alive and talking, not the evidence destroyed. She didn't argue, which told him she'd already run the same logic and arrived at the same place. They moved through the side streets in the dark, taking the long route around rather than cutting back through the alley, which was either still occupied by two embarrassed men or had been cleared by whoever had sent them. Either way, not a path worth revisiting. The hardware store was on Meridian Street, a flat-fronted brick building with a darkened display window and a hand-painted sign. The door to the upper unit was on the side, a narrow staircase that smelled like wood polish and old insulation. Emily went up first. She stopped at the top landing and put her ear to the door before unlocking it. Clear, she said quietly, and that word and the way she used it, flat, habitual, told Damon more about her background than anything she'd said on the bench. The apartment was small and clean and almost aggressively without personality, not because it was poorly furnished, but because everything in it could be packed in under an hour. There was nothing on the walls. The books on the shelf were paperbacks, the kind you could leave behind. The furniture was functional and not particularly attached to. She went straight to the radiator in the far corner. He watched the window. The service lane below was empty. The street visible through the front window showed normal evening traffic, a couple walking a dog, a teenager on a bicycle. Nothing that spiked the same instinct that the slow car had. Emily came back from the radiator with a drive the size of a deck of cards, matte black, sealed in what looked like a weatherproof casing. She slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket. Clothes? He asked. I'll manage. You're not coming back here. She looked around the apartment for a moment. Whatever she felt about that, she filed it somewhere interior and not visible. She pulled a backpack from under the bed, already half-packed, he noticed, the way people packed who'd had to leave before, and added a few items from the dresser in the bathroom without rushing. 3 minutes from entry to exit. He timed it without thinking about it. He'd driven a rental, which was imperfect. Rentals were traceable, but it was what he had, and they needed distance more than they needed operational elegance. He drove south out of Merritt Cove on the state route rather than the highway, staying under the speed limit, watching the mirrors. Axel was in the back. Emily was in the passenger seat with the backpack between her feet, looking at the side mirror every few minutes with the disciplined attention of someone trained to do it, and not the anxious fidgeting of someone doing it out of fear. Where are we going? She asked. I have a contact 3 hours south. Former Intel, she runs a private security consultancy now. Off the grid enough to be useful, straight enough not to get us both arrested. She know you're coming? She will in about 20 minutes when I call her. And you trust her? It wasn't quite a question. As much as I trust anyone who isn't in this car. Emily absorbed that. I need to know what you're planning to do with what I told you. He kept his eyes on the road. The state route wound through dark trees, the occasional house light moving past on either side. I want to understand what you found before I decide anything. That's not a plan. No, it's a starting point. What you described, falsified mission records, money moving, a cover-up that killed 6 people, that's not a rogue operator. That's an organizational problem with organizational protection. He paused, which means going through normal channels gets us nowhere, and probably gets you found before we make it 3 steps. I know that. I've known that for 4 years. There was no bitterness in it, just the dull precision of someone stating a familiar fact. The documentation I have is complete. Financial transfers, mission logs, cross-reference casualty reports. It's enough. It's been enough for 4 years. The problem isn't the evidence. The problem is who to give it to. The problem is who's left to give it to that they haven't already reached. She looked out the passenger window. I spent 6 months trying to identify a clean pathway. Every oversight office I could verify, every inspector general contact, every congressional staffer with a defense background, every single route either dead-ended at someone with a conflict of interest or went silent after I made initial contact. You contacted them directly? Anonymously. Thoroughly anonymously. But the responses I did get were wrong. The language, the speed of response on some of them. Someone was watching those channels. Damon drove in thought. The trees moved past. Somewhere about 40 miles south, the road would open up and the lights of a larger town would appear. And he'd pull over and make the call to Nora Kessick, who would answer on the 3rd ring the way she always did because she slept lightly and kept her phone on the nightstand and had done both since Kandahar. The unit, he said. The classified unit you were attached to. Who authorized it? The operational authorization ran through a joint command structure. Multiple signatures, but the day-to-day direction, funding, mission assignment, personnel deployment, that ran through a single office. One brigadier general with enough clearance to run it and enough political cover to keep it running. Name. She didn't answer immediately. Emily. If this is going to go anywhere. Marcus Vance, she said. The name sat between them in the dark car. Damon's hands didn't move on the wheel, which took some effort. Vance, he said. You know him. I know of him. He'd known of Marcus Vance the way anyone at his level and his clearance tier knew of Vance, as a name that appeared on certain documents, that moved through certain command layers, that had accumulated over a 20-year career a specific reputation for being untouchable. Not untouchable the way excellent officers were untouchable. Untouchable the way men with long institutional memory and longer lists of us were untouchable. He's a brigadier general. He was a colonel when I served under his operational authority. He made brigadier 2 years after the fire. Promoted after covering it up. Promoted because the people who could have blocked the promotion were either compromised or dead. She said it without inflection. He's been very careful, Colonel. Whatever you're thinking about doing, he's already anticipated it, or he will. He didn't anticipate me walking into that diner. No, she said, but he anticipated that when someone came looking, I'd be found. He's been patient. He can afford to be. He's got another 6 years before mandatory separation, and by then the statute window on most of what he did gets complicated. She turned to look at him. He doesn't need to win. He just needs to wait. Damon drove another mile before he said anything. Not if we move faster than he can wait. Nora Kessick answered on the 3rd ring, as predicted, with "This better be worth it," rather than "hello," which was how she'd answered his calls for 11 years. "It's worth it," he said. "You're on leave." "I'm aware." "Mandatory leave. As in, the kind where the word mandatory is doing, I know what mandatory means, Nora. I need your place for a few days. Clean network, secure room, the usual. And I'm bringing someone." A pause. "Someone you trust or someone you're evaluating?" "Both." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring, it was meant to be accurate." Another pause. Longer. He could hear her sitting up in bed, the creak of it, the shuffle of someone reorienting from sleep to operational. Is this connected to anything active? Potentially connected to a brigadier general with a budget problem and a body count. A long silence. I'll put the coffee on, she said, and hung up. Tit. Nora Kessick's property sat at the end of a dirt road 9 miles outside the town of Aldermore, which was itself not a town that appeared on most maps at a useful scale. The house was a converted farmhouse with a steel-reinforced exterior that looked like renovation work, and wasn't a generator, a satellite uplink that ran through 3 routing points before touching anything identifiable, and a large dog named Garrison who was retired military, like most things on the property. She met them at the door at 11:40 p.m. with coffee and the particular kind of narrow-eyed assessment that she applied to everything and everyone, and she looked at Emily the way a person looked at someone they were trying to place without context. Nora Kessick, she said. She was in her late 40s, dark-skinned, compact, with close-cropped hair and the posture of someone who'd spent decades making herself harder to underestimate. Emily Voss, Emily said. Damon says you have documentation on Marcus Vance. I do. How complete? Complete enough that if it reached the right people, he'd be finished. Nora looked at her for another beat. And the problem is finding the right people. The problem, Emily said, is finding the ones he hasn't gotten to first. Nora stepped aside and let them in. I have some thoughts on that, us. They worked through the night and into the early morning at Nora's kitchen table, which was large enough to spread out a laptop and several physical documents and still have room for coffee cups, and the notepad Nora filled with her precise, small handwriting. Axel and Garrison had sorted out their hierarchy without incident within the first 10 minutes, and were now sharing the floor near the wood stove. Emily's drive contained 4 years of accumulated and cross-referenced documentation. Damon had expected it to be substantial. She described it as complete, and she used words carefully. But the scope of it hit differently when it was on a screen in front of him. Financial transaction logs going back 7 years. Transfer records between shell accounts, all traceable with the right forensic software, all connected to a central disbursement point that corresponded to a DoD contractor address that Nora identified within 6 minutes as a defunct company with no employees and a registered agent in a state with minimal disclosure requirements. Mission logs? The real ones, not the filed versions, documenting operations that had been officially characterized as training exercises or equipment transfers. Cross-referenced against casualty reports that showed, in one documented case, a 4-person operator team marked as lost in a training accident who had actually died in an active engagement in a country where the U.S. had no official operational presence. She had no official presence either, Emily said, pointing to a name in the log. That's my team member, specialist in canine trauma medicine. She's listed as a training accident fatality. She died in that building because the exit door had been externally secured. She said it steadily, the way someone said things they'd had a long time to accept and hadn't quite managed it. She'd been with the unit 3 years. No one said anything for a moment. Nora tapped the disbursement records. The money flow is the most actionable piece of this. The mission logs are damning, but logs can be challenged. Chain of custody, data integrity, source authentication. Financial transfers are harder to argue with. She pulled the laptop closer. I know someone at the Financial Crimes Division of the DOJ, not a friend, but someone who owes me a specific kind of professional debt that makes honesty more appealing than the alternative. She'd look at this. How do we know Vance hasn't reached her? Damon asked. Because she's in financial crimes, not defense oversight. She's outside the ecosystem he's been managing. The risk is there, but it's lower. She looked at Emily. The bigger concern is verification. We need to establish that this data is authentic, not tampered with, not manufactured, not sourced from a compromised chain. Can you document the chain of custody for any of this? I can document how I obtained the original records and the method of preservation. The encryption timestamps on the drive are original and intact. Emily paused. I also have 2 witnesses. Damon looked up. I thought you said your team was eliminated, he said. I said I was the only survivor. She looked at him carefully. I had 2 sources who weren't on my team. Civilians. One was a contractor accountant who first flagged the financial discrepancies to me. The other was an operator who participated in one of the falsified missions and filed an internal complaint that disappeared. She stopped. I've had no contact with either of them since before the fire. I don't know if they're alive. If they are, Nora said, and if they testify, and if they're reachable, and if Vance hasn't already found them, Emily said. That's a lot of conditional. It is, Nora agreed, but it's more than we had an hour ago. Damon was looking at the financial records, scrolling slowly. Something at the edge of the data was pulling at him. A pattern in the disbursement timing, transactions clustered around specific dates that he recognized. Not because he'd seen the records before, but because he recognized what they corresponded to. He stopped scrolling. Nora, he said, pull the operational calendar for the joint task force that ran the Kazan province operations. You still have access? She looked at him. The operation you were involved in that's still under review? Yes. She was quiet for a moment, then turned to her laptop and started working. Emily watched him. What are you seeing? Maybe nothing. He kept his eyes on the screen. Maybe a reason why my operation ended up under review and my CO put me on mandatory leave right now, at this specific moment. He pointed at a cluster of dates in the financial log. These transactions, they're dated within the same 2-week window as the initial phase of my last operation. The operation that had 2 anomalous equipment requests that went through a non-standard approval chain. Emily leaned in and looked at the dates. Her expression changed. He was running a secondary operation alongside yours, she said slowly, using your operational infrastructure as cover for the money movement. Which means if his operation comes apart, it looks connected to yours, which is why you're under review. She sat back. He put you in a position where investigating him implicates you. If you push on Vance, the review gets more serious. If you walk away, he keeps moving. Nora looked up from her laptop. I've got the operational calendar. She studied both screens. Damon, these dates align exactly. The kitchen was quiet, except for the low sound of the wood stove and the breathing of 2 dogs. He's been using me as insulation, Damon said. It came out flat, the way things came out when you were angry, and keeping the anger compacted because spreading it around wouldn't help. For how long? At minimum, Emily said, since before my team was killed. He's very good at arranging proximity, plausible cover. People who look connected to his operations without knowing they are. She looked at him. You're not the first. He pushed back from the table, walked to the window. The dark outside was complete. No road lights this far out, just the property floodlight catching the edge of the driveway gravel and the tree line beyond. He'd spent 11 months on the Kazan operation. He'd lost 2 people. He'd been in front of oversight boards twice. He'd been told his command decisions were being scrutinized. He'd accepted that scrutiny as legitimate, as the cost of complex operations in contested spaces, because he believed in accountability, and he believed the review was genuine. And all of it, the review and the scrutiny and the mandatory leave, had been architecture. Built to keep him in place and keep him quiet and make any movement he made toward investigating anything look like a man protecting himself. He's going to know we're together, Emily said. Not yet. But when the men from the alley report back and Vance runs the inquiry log from the DOD system, he'll see your search. He'll connect the timing. She looked at him steadily. He'll move faster now. So do we, Damon said. He turned back from the window. Nora was watching him with the careful attention of someone deciding how deep in they were willing to go, and he knew that look. He'd seen her make that calculation before. And he waited. The DOJ contact, Nora said finally. I'll reach out tomorrow, early. She looked at Emily. And the 2 witnesses. Can you locate them without surfacing yourself? I have methods. It'll take time. We may not have much. I know. Emily was already reaching for the drive. I've been saying that to myself for 4 years. She began reorganizing the files on screen, flagging the most critical financial documentation, the clearest chain of custody evidence, the records that were independently verifiable without her testimony. Her movements at the keyboard were precise and quick, and Damon watched her work and thought about the 6 people who died in that building, and the operator team marked as a training accident, and the way Vance had promoted himself on top of all of it. Garrison lifted his head from the floor. Axel did the same, 1 second later. Both dogs were looking at the front of the house. Damon and Nora registered it in the same instant. "How many people know you were going to Merritt Cove?" Nora asked, very quietly. "My CO knew I was taking leave. I didn't specify." He stopped. "The rental car. It's registered to a DoD travel account. If someone ran the account—" "Someone did," Nora said. She was already moving toward the hall, pulling a lockbox off a high shelf, and Damon recognized the size and weight of what she lifted out of it. Emily looked up from the laptop. She'd heard the dogs. She'd understood what they meant. She reached down and closed the laptop with one hand and slid the drive into her jacket pocket with the other, and when she stood, she was already scanning the room for exits with the same automatic sweep she'd used in the diner that morning. Outside, beyond the tree line, something moved in a way that didn't match wind or wildlife. Damon killed the floodlight from the interior switch before anyone said another word. The kitchen dropped into near total dark. Nora moved without hesitation to the far wall, where a second panel sat behind a hinged section of wood trim, and two things happened simultaneously. Heavy shutters locked across the front windows with a sound like bolts seating in a rifle, and the Wi-Fi router on the counter went dark. Emily was already beside Damon, and she hadn't asked what to do or where to stand. She'd moved to a wall and kept low and stayed out of the sightlines. He registered that without comment. "Back door," Nora said quietly. "There's a root cellar access under the kitchen rug. Goes out to the woodshed 40 feet from the tree line." "How many ways onto the property?" Damon asked. 3 vehicle routes. Foot access from any direction through the tree line. The perimeter sensors caught 2 thermal contacts north side, could be more." She was checking what she'd pulled from the lockbox. A compact sidearm, already racked. With the movements of someone performing a task they'd repeated so many times, it lived in muscle memory rather than active thought. "The dogs heard it before the sensors flagged it. That's at least 2 minutes of approach we didn't see." "They came quiet," Emily said. "Yes." "That's not a snatch team. Snatch teams make noise on purpose. It destabilizes the target, makes compliance faster." She looked toward the front of the house. "This is containment." Nora looked at her. "Which means?" "They're not here to grab us. They're here to make sure nothing leaves." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. Damon processed it and reached the same conclusion Emily had, and it sat in his chest like something cold and structural. "The drive," he said. "Still on me." She put one hand over the jacket pocket without thinking about it. A reflex, not a performance. "What do you have in this building, Nora? Weapons, go bags, anything transmitting?" "I have a hardwired terminal in the back room that routes through a separate line from the satellite. If they haven't cut the ground line, how long to get a data burst out?" Nora thought for exactly 1 second. 3 minutes to establish the connection, 2 more to run the transfer if the file size is what I think it is. 5 minutes, Emily said. "If the line's intact?" "Then we need 5 minutes, Damon said, and that was the whole conversation. Nora moved toward the back room. Damon went low to the front window and looked through the narrow gap at the edge of the shutter, wood exterior, just enough clearance to see the driveway without being visible from outside. 2 shapes at the tree line, dark clothing, moving with the deliberate patience of people who'd been trained not to hurry. A 3rd contact, further north, stationary, watching the back. 3 he could see. Probably more he couldn't. He pulled back from the window and went to the kitchen. Emily was there. In the dark, she'd found Nora's knife block and taken the longest blade, not because it was useful against what was outside, but because having something in your hand was different from having nothing. "They'll move when they're ready," he said quietly, "not when we want them to." "I know." "If they breach, I know, Damon." He looked at her. In the near dark, her face was composed, not calm. There was a difference, and he could see it. The composed expression of someone maintaining function while the interior ran hard. She'd done this before. Not exactly this, but the shape of it. He didn't say anything else. He went to find Nora. The back room was tight, filing cabinet, a server rack that hummed with operational patience, a desk with a hardwired terminal. Nora was already seated, moving through a boot sequence that she'd clearly done before and didn't need light to complete. "Lines up," she said. "Someone's careful out there. They didn't cut the ground wire." "They didn't know it was there," Damon said. "Probably." Her fingers moved. "Emily, drive." Emily was in the doorway. She crossed to the desk and handed Nora the drive. Nora plugged it in without ceremony and started the transfer protocol. The progress bar on screen was the most consequential rectangle Damon had looked at in 11 months of consequential situations. From the front of the house, Garrison started a low, continuous growl that he was clearly controlling, the sound a trained dog made when he'd identified a threat and was waiting for instruction. Axel, beside him, was silent. Silent was worse. 2 minutes in, something hit the front door. Not a breach attempt. A single, heavy impact, like a boot test. Checking construction, checking resistance, professional habit. Nora didn't look up from the screen. Another impact. The shutters held. The door was reinforced. Damon could see from the frame construction it wasn't hollow core and wasn't standard residential, but reinforced residential and military grade were different categories. 60 seconds, Nora said. The north window, shuttered, locked, took a hit that made the whole wall shudder. Whatever they'd used was heavy. The shutter dented inward slightly, frame straining. A second hit, same spot. Methodical. Damon moved back to the doorway between rooms. If they came through the north wall, there was 10 feet of open floor before the backroom door. 10 feet was nothing. The shutter gave. Not completely, it was still in the frame, but one corner bent inward, and the night air came through the gap cold and immediate. And 2 seconds later, a canister came through the gap and hit the floor and started throwing white. Smoke, not gas. He smelled it before he could see it. Thick synthetic smoke, the kind that killed visibility in under 30 seconds without affecting respiration. "Nora," he said. "I hear it. 20 seconds." He moved to the front room, pulled his shirt over his mouth, went flat against the wall beside the damaged shutter. The smoke was already building. It moved fast, designed to, rolling low across the floor and climbing. Through the gap in the bent shutter, he could see a shape moving toward the front door. Axel appeared at his left side, low, ready. "Hold," Damon said. The front door took a breach hit at the lock. A ram, something hand-carried, and the door held but the frame cracked and the second hit put it open. The shape came through fast, moving left, the way entry training dictated, and Damon's hand closed on a wrist, and he redirected the momentum and put the man into the wall with enough force that the plaster cracked behind him. The man wasn't small. He recovered faster than anticipated and got an elbow back that connected with Damon's cheekbone, which went white-hot and made his left eye water immediately. Axel took the man's arm. The arm stopped working in the capacity the man needed. A second shape through the door. Damon was already moving, but the smoke was thick enough now that he was navigating by sound and outline, and the second man was using a light mounted under a weapon that cut through the smoke in a narrow beam. The beam found Damon and the trigger hesitated. They wanted him alive, or wanted to know what he had on him first. And that single hesitation was enough for Damon to get inside the arm and take the weapon and use it to redirect the man's center of gravity down. From the back room. "Done. Transfers complete." 3 words. They meant the evidence was out, wherever Nora had sent it, to whichever secured contact, through whichever routing. It was out of the building and out of the drive and out of the reach of anyone currently standing in this smoke-filled farmhouse. He heard Emily say it. He heard her exhale, brief and compressed, the sound of someone releasing 4 years of held tension in a single breath. And then he heard something else, a sound from the back of the property, different from the breach team. A vehicle, heavy, the particular engine note of something large and armored, and it wasn't moving like an approach. It was moving like it had already arrived, and it was positioning. This wasn't the whole operation. The breach team was the distraction. What? The root cellar access was under the kitchen rug, as Nora had said, a pull ring handle and a short ladder down to a packed earth passage that smelled like cold and old wood. Nora went first, then Emily, then Damon pulled the rug back over the hatch from below, which didn't accomplish much but bought 2 seconds, and 2 seconds sometimes mattered. The passage was low, head clearance only if you were Nora's height, and Damon moved through it bent at the shoulders, following the pale shape of Nora's jacket ahead of him. Axel behind him, no command needed. Garrison had been released from his stay position and came last. The passage ended at a wooden hatch that opened into the floor of the woodshed. Nora came up first, eased the hatch, assessed, came up the rest of the way. Clear. The woodshed was a working shed, stacked split logs, tools, a tarp-covered shape in the corner that turned out to be a trail bike, single cylinder, functional. No vehicle traffic noise from inside it. But through the wooden slats, Damon could see the floodlights of the large vehicle now positioned at the south side of the property. 2 men with it, standing, not advancing, waiting. "They're not chasing," Emily said quietly. "They're containing," Nora said. "They think we're still in the house." "How long until they figure out we're not?" "When the team inside reports." Nora looked at the tree line, 40 feet of open ground between the woodshed and the first tree cover. No lights pointing this direction yet. "We go on the dogs." Damon looked at Axel. The dog was scenting the air, body loose, ears forward, not signaling threat in the tree line direction. "Clear," Damon said, and believed it. They ran. 40 feet felt like 400. The ground was uneven, early frost had hardened the grass into irregular ridges, and they covered it without light, without noise, with the particular economy of people who'd all at some point run across open ground and understood the arithmetic of exposure time. The tree line swallowed them. Behind them, someone shouted from the vicinity of the house. Not a signal, a discovery. They'd found the passage, or found the kitchen empty, or found something else that told them where the targets were not. Nora took point through the trees, moving with the certainty of someone who'd walked this specific ground in the dark deliberately, more than once, because she was the kind of person who prepared for specific contingencies, and this had been one of them. Damon moved behind her, Emily behind him. The dogs flanked. A quarter-mile in, the tree cover thinned at the edge of a gravel track, a logging road, cut straight, running east to west. At the eastern end, barely visible, a dark-colored truck sat parked nose out at the road junction. No plates visible from this distance. "Theirs or yours?" Damon asked. "Mine," Nora said. "Registered to a company that doesn't connect to me. Keys are under the left rear wheel well." She looked back through the trees. The lights from the property were moving now. Someone had found the woodshed entrance and was orienting south. "We have maybe 4 minutes." They moved to the truck. The keys were where she'd said. Emily was already at the passenger side, and Damon registered automatically that she'd positioned herself where she could watch the road in both directions without being asked. Nora didn't get in. He looked at her. "The DOJ contact," she said. "I need to make that call from somewhere they can't tie to either of you. If I'm in this truck, I'm a third target, and I slow your route." She held out her phone. Different from her regular phone, a secondary he hadn't known she carried. Transferred the contact to this. "She's listed under the name Oatfield. Tell her the Halcyon documentation is verified and sourced. She'll know what that means." "Nora, Get in the truck, Damon." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with the particular patience of someone who'd already made a decision and was waiting for the other person to accept it. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I have other places." She tilted her head toward the tree line. "And I'm better in these woods than anyone they brought tonight." She glanced at Emily. "The logging road runs 12 miles east before it hits the state route. Don't use the highway until you're 2 counties south." Emily said, "Thank you." Nora looked at her, a full assessing look, and something passed between them that wasn't warmth exactly, but was the specific recognition that passed between people who'd both been underestimated by systems that should have protected them. "Don't waste it," Nora said, and walked back into the trees. They drove east on the logging road with the headlights off for the first mile, navigating by the edge of the gravel and the gap in the tree canopy above. Emily held the secondary phone and Damon drove, and Axel sat in the back, and the truck cab smelled like must and old work gloves, and neither of them spoke because there wasn't anything to say that was more urgent than covering distance. 2 miles out, Damon turned the headlights on. "She'll be okay," Emily said. She said it without being asked, which meant she'd been thinking about it. "Yeah." He wasn't certain, but Nora had earned the right to his uncertainty rather than his worry. Emily was looking at the phone. "Halcyon documentation. That's what she said to tell the contact." "Did that word appear in your records?" She was quiet for a moment. Halcyon was the internal designation for the secondary operation, the one running underneath the official missions. She looked up. Nora knew that. She knew before tonight. He processed that. "She's been working this from another angle." "Apparently." Emily turned the phone over in her hands. "Which means the DOJ contact isn't cold. Nora's already been in contact. She exhaled. Which is either very good news or it's how they found us at the farm. The thought landed and stayed. If the DOJ contact has been compromised, she started. Then Nora just walked back into the trees with compromised information. He tightened his hands on the wheel. Call the number, right now. Let's find out. She dialed. The phone rang 3 times. A woman answered. Her voice was professional and awake, which was notable at this hour. Oatfield, she said. I'm calling on behalf of Nora Kessick, Emily said. She said to tell you the Halcyon documentation is verified and sourced. A pause. Who are you? Someone who was there. Another pause, longer. Is Nora safe? We don't know. The woman on the other end made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a breath and a decision being made. I've been waiting on this contact for 6 weeks. Nora told me the source documentation existed and was complete, but she couldn't move without the primary source confirming it. Her voice was careful, precise. That's you. Yes. Are you in a secure location? Emily looked at the tree-lined logging road, the dark truck, the man beside her navigating by headlight. No. I need 24 hours to move a protective detail into position. If what Nora described is accurate, if the financial documentation is intact, then this goes federal, and it goes fast, and you need to be somewhere I can put people around you. 24 hours is a long time. I know, the woman said. Do you have somewhere to go for 24 hours? Emily looked at Damon. He was already thinking. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved over the road without really seeing it. He was running through options. She watched him land on something. There's a location, he said. Old field facility, decommissioned, 3 years off any active roster. I used it for staging during a domestic training rotation. It's not in my official file. It's in a supplemental that never made it past the planning phase. He glanced at her. Vance wouldn't have it. How far? Emily asked. 7 hours. She put the phone back to her ear. We have somewhere. 7 hours out. Give me the coordinates when you arrive. I'll have people moving toward you within 2 hours of receipt. A brief pause. And whoever you are, if this holds up, if the documentation is what Nora said it is, this matters. What you're doing matters. Emily said nothing to that. She thanked her and ended the call. The logging road ran out into the state route and Damon turned south, and the truck picked up speed and the darkness outside moved from forest to open fields, and the sky had that particular density of deep night that came just before the first gray suggestion of morning began at the edges. Emily put the phone in her jacket pocket next to the drive. She sat with it for a while. 7 hours was a long time and also not very long. She thought about Nora in the trees. She thought about the woman named Oatfield who'd been waiting 6 weeks. She thought about the 2 witnesses she hadn't contacted yet, the contractor accountant and the operator who'd filed the complaint, and whether they were still findable and whether they'd be willing to surface. She thought about the building, the one that burned, and the 6 people in it. She thought about Axel pressing himself against her legs in a diner on a Tuesday morning, and the colonel who'd looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, and how neither of them had had any idea what they were walking into. You doing okay? Damon asked. He asked it plainly, without the careful orchestration men sometimes used around that question when they were uncomfortable with the answer. No, she said. Okay. And he didn't press it, which was the right thing to do. They were 40 minutes south on the state route when the phone in her jacket pocket, not the secondary phone, her phone, the one she'd had for 2 years under her built identity, lit up with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. We have the contractor accountant. He's been talking for 3 hours. You should know, Vance isn't waiting for daylight. He's already moving to the facility. She stared at the message. The facility. 7 hours out. The location Damon had named in the truck cab, not on any official roster, not in any file that should be reachable. Her hands went cold. Damon, she said. He heard her tone and looked over. She held up the phone. He read it. His jaw tightened slowly, the way it did when he was processing something he didn't want to be true. Someone heard us in the truck, he said, or someone's already inside the place we're going. He looked at the road ahead, the flat dark of it, running south through open country, no exits visible, no options visible, just the road and the speed and the 7 hours between them, and the only location that was supposed to be safe. The phone lit up again. Same number, 2 words, turn around. Damon pulled over. Not a slow coast to the shoulder, a hard stop, gravel spraying, the truck fishtailing slightly on the loose edge before it settled. He left the engine running. Emily was already staring at the phone. 2 words, turn around. From a number that had known the facility name before either of them had said it aloud to anyone. They'd been in the truck alone, windows up, no calls made. The coordinates hadn't been transmitted anywhere yet. Someone's in the truck, she said. He was already pulling the sun visor down, checking it. Nothing. He reached under the dashboard. His hand moved fast and precise along the wiring harness, the underside of the dash panel, the seam between the center console and the floor. Emily got out and ran her hands along the underside of the rear wheel wells, the frame rails, the trailer hitch recess. Axel was on the seat watching her with focused intensity. She found it under the left rear bumper cover. Magnetic mount, small enough to miss in a quick inspection. She peeled it off and held it up. Damon came around the back of the truck and looked at it. A tracker. Civilian-grade shell, but the internals, she cracked it against the truck frame and looked at the board, were not civilian grade. She dropped it on the road and put her boot through it. They tagged Nora's truck before tonight, she said. They knew about this vehicle before they came to the farm. Which means they let us run. The thought settled between them. They'd broken from the farmhouse, made it through the trees, reached the truck, driven 12 miles east and turned south, and all of it had been visible. The breach team at the farm wasn't a containment operation. It was a flush, driving them toward the road, toward the truck, toward the tracking device that would then walk them directly to wherever they went next. Vance wasn't trying to stop the documentation from moving. He already knew where it was going. He was trying to find out who else knew. Oatfield, Emily said. The call. Damon looked at her. We called her from Nora's secondary phone. If this truck was tagged, the phone may be too. She pulled out the secondary phone and turned it over. No visible modification on the exterior, but a tracker didn't need to be visible. Or the call was monitored. If her line has been touched, then Vance already has the facility location, Damon said. And the contact at DOJ? The road was empty in both directions. The fields on either side were flat and dark, no wind, no sound except the truck engine and somewhere very far north, an aircraft, military prop plane at altitude, the kind of sound that most people couldn't identify, and Damon identified automatically. He looked up, couldn't see it. The text, he said. Turn around. Someone sent that as a warning, not Vance. Vance doesn't warn. Emily was looking at the number again. I don't know this number. Think. Who else knew you existed before tonight? She was quiet for a full 10 seconds. The contractor accountant. The man who flagged the financial records to me. She looked up. The text said Vance had him, that he'd been talking for 3 hours. If he gave Vance your contact methods, any of them, he didn't know my contact methods. He knew me by a different name, different face, different context. Her voice was tight but controlled. But if Vance had him and he was talking, he may have given enough to surface other pieces. And if someone else was monitoring Vance's operation, someone else sent the warning, Damon finished. She looked at the crushed tracker on the road. The operator, the one who filed the internal complaint. I never made direct contact with him after the fire, but he knew my unit. If he's been watching from the outside... She stopped. She pulled out her own phone, her 2-year identity phone, the one the text had come to, and called the number back. It rang 4 times. A man answered. His voice was low and slightly rough, like someone who'd been awake a long time. I wasn't sure you'd call. Who are you? My name is Garrett Rowe. I was with the 14th Operational Detachment. 4 years ago, I filed a complaint about mission discrepancies in the Halcyon series. The complaint disappeared and I was transferred to a desk in Guam. A pause. I've been watching Vance's network for 2 years. When your colonel ran the database inquiry 3 days ago, it tripped a monitor I had on the K9 medical rosters. I've been tracking movement since. Emily looked at Damon. He could hear enough of the voice to follow it. You said Vance has the accountant, she said. Had. He's been moved to protective federal custody as of 90 minutes ago. The DOJ contact your woman Kessick reached. She moved fast once she got the data burst. She already had a partial case built. A pause. But Vance got enough from the preliminary interview to know the documentation is out of your hands, which is more dangerous for you, not less. He can't suppress the evidence now, so you become the problem. He wants us silenced, she said. He wants you to disappear before you can testify. Documentation without a primary witness who can authenticate it and withstand cross-examination has gaps. Gaps a defense team can work. Roe's voice was flat, experienced. You're the chain of custody. You're the authentication. Without you, the case is harder. Not impossible, but harder. And Vance has spent 20 years making hard things fail. Damon took the phone from her. Roe. Damon Holt. What's Vance's current position? He left the D.C. metro area 4 hours ago. Private transport, off manifests. We don't have confirmed location, but the movement pattern and the team he's deployed suggests he's heading northeast. A pause. Toward you. The facility I mentioned in the truck? Don't go there. Don't go anywhere you've said aloud in that vehicle. Then where? The line was quiet for a moment. When Roe spoke again, there was the quality of a man making a decision he'd been holding in reserve. There's a deposition suite in the federal building in Harwick. It's a city, it's public, it's monitored. Oatfield can have an investigative team there in 6 hours. If you can reach Harwick, Harwick is 4 hours south on the highway, Damon said. I know. Vance is moving northeast. I know that too. A brief flat pause. The highway is exposed. Every exit point is visible. But Vance's team is distributed. He doesn't have enough people to cover every route. He's concentrating on the facility location because that's where he thinks you're going. Another pause. If you move now, you have a window. Damon handed the phone back to Emily. She looked at him. 4 hours on the highway, he said. In a truck Vance's people have the plate for. He thought. There's a travel plaza 12 miles south. Long-haul commercial traffic. We leave the truck, find different transport. He looked at Axel in the back seat. The dog was alert but still, watching him. We'll manage. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression, not hesitation exactly, more the brief acknowledgement of a person who'd been managing alone for 4 years and was still recalibrating to the reality of not managing alone. Okay, she said. They got back in the truck. The travel plaza was busy enough at 4 a.m. that a man, a woman, a dog, and a backpack didn't read as unusual. Long-haul drivers on rotation, a family in a minivan with 2 sleeping kids, a group of college students who'd made the wrong turn on a road trip and were too tired to be embarrassed about it. The fluorescent light inside the service building was the particular quality of light that existed outside of normal time. Damon found the transport in the far parking lot. A man named Cobble, semi-retired, running a personal vehicle south for a relocation client, $300 in cash for the ride. No questions. The kind of arrangement that existed in every travel plaza in the country and predated ride-sharing apps by several decades. Cobble looked at the dog, looked at Damon, looked at Emily, and said the back seat was big enough and he'd stop talking once they started moving. He was as good as his word. Emily called Roe twice during the drive, once to confirm they'd changed vehicles, once when Roe reported that Vance's team had arrived at the decommissioned facility and found it empty. She listened to Roe's account of it, the facility breach, the realization, the 30-minute gap before Vance's people started recalibrating, and she thought about the expression on Vance's face when he understood the target wasn't there. She'd spent 4 years not being able to picture that. Now she could. It didn't feel as satisfying as she'd expected. It felt operational. It felt like a step. Damon slept for 40 minutes with his head against the window, which told her everything about his physical state. He'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, and he'd been in a physical altercation, and the cheekbone where the elbow had connected was swollen and darkening. When he woke, he was immediately alert, which was not how most people woke up, and was the specific waking pattern of someone who'd trained the transition from sleep to function for a long time. How far? He asked. Hour 20. He looked at the dark outside. The highway was moving past, other vehicles sparse at this hour, the landscape flat and edgeless. Roe, you trust him? I trust that his account is internally consistent and his information has been accurate so far. She looked out the window. I trust him the way you trust Oatfield, enough to keep moving, not enough to stop looking. Fair. The complaint he filed, 4 years ago. If it disappeared the way mine did, he's been sitting on everything he knew for 4 years with nowhere to take it. She paused. That does something to a person. Damon didn't answer immediately. Yeah. You've been sitting on something too, the Kazan review. 11 months of knowing something was wrong and not being able to name it. That's different. Is it? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a highway sign indicated 30 miles to the Harwick exit. No, he said. It's not different. She looked at him. The swelling under his eye was worse in the overhead light of a passing truck. He hadn't complained about it. She thought about saying something about the swelling and decided against it. He knew it was there, and commenting on it wouldn't help anything. When this is over, she said, the review board is going to have to reckon with the fact that your operation was used as cover for Vance's secondary program. I know. That means everything they've built against your command decisions falls apart. I know that too. He shifted in the seat. It doesn't feel clean because it isn't. 2 people from my unit died on that operation. The review was supposed to answer for that. Now it gets complicated by Vance's involvement, and I'm not sure the actual question, whether my decisions were sound, ever gets cleanly answered. Were they? He looked out the window. Mostly, not entirely. I made calls under incomplete information that I'd make differently now. A pause. That's most of it. She understood that. She'd made calls too. She'd chosen to document rather than run sooner. She'd believed in the oversight process long enough that the fire had time to happen. Cobble drove them through the dark without comment, radio low on something country that nobody was listening to. Part 10. The federal building in Harwick was a glass and concrete structure on a downtown corner that looked exactly like what it was, which was either reassuring or the opposite depending on what you'd spent the last several days doing. Oatfield, whose real name turned out to be Diane Marsh, Deputy Director of Financial Crimes, with a unit that had apparently been quietly building a Halcyon-adjacent case for 8 months, met them in an underground parking structure with 2 agents and a woman from the JAG Corps who was introduced only as Stern, and who shook Emily's hand with the focused attention of someone who'd read a file and was now matching it to a person. The documentation burst from Keswick's terminal arrived intact, Marsh said. She looked tired in the specific way of people who'd been working something big for a long time and were now at the point where the work was about to become real rather than theoretical. We've had forensic accountants on the financial records since 3 a.m. The transaction chains are intact and traceable. We've confirmed 4 shell company nodes, 2 of which we'd independently identified as suspicious without being able to source them. And the mission logs? Emily asked. More complicated. The logs are internally consistent, but we need independent verification of the classification levels and the operational context. Marsh looked at her. That's you. I can do that. It'll take time. It needs to be done on the record, in deposition, with full chain of custody documentation for the drive and the original acquisition method. She paused. I need to be clear with you about where this stands. The financial case is strong and getting stronger. The mission log case needs your testimony. Without you, I understand, Emily said. I've been told. Vance's legal team, and he has one, retained preemptively, which tells you something, will challenge every link they can reach. They'll go after your credibility, your circumstances, your method of documentation. Marsh looked at her steadily. They'll be thorough and they'll be good at it, and it's going to be unpleasant. I've been unpleasant for 4 years, Emily said. I can manage a few more months. Stern, the JAG officer, made a small sound that might have been a laugh and was definitely approval. They took her to a deposition room on the 4th floor, windowless, clean, 2 recorders and a legal team and a stenographer who set up with the efficient neutrality of someone for whom high-stakes testimony was simply the job. Damon waited outside. He'd offered, and she'd told him to wait, not dismissively, but because what came next was hers to do alone. She sat down across from Stern and Marsh and a third person she hadn't been introduced to who turned out to be from the DOD Inspector General's office, and she began to talk. She talked for 3 hours. Not continuously. There were questions, clarifications. chains of documentation that had to be traced in real time, moments where she was asked to identify specific records on the drive and explain her acquisition method and the preservation steps. She talked about her unit and her work and what she'd found and when she'd found it and what she'd done with it and what had happened to the building and to her team. She said their names on the record, all of them, which she'd never done in an official context before, and it was harder than she'd expected, and she got through it. Outside in the hall, Damon paced. He'd been given coffee and a medical consult he'd declined and then accepted when the swelling under his eye got tight enough to affect his vision, and he sat in a chair with an ice pack against his cheekbone while an agent updated him on Vance's current position. Vance had been tracked to a private airfield in Vermont, attempting to board a chartered flight. The timing had been close. Federal marshals arrived 11 minutes before the scheduled departure. The arrest had not been quiet. 3 of Vance's personal security detail had attempted to interpose themselves, and 2 of them were now being processed on obstruction charges, which Damon thought was a fitting preliminary to whatever came next. Rowe had been brought in separately, Harwick field office, different entrance. He and Damon hadn't spoken yet. They would. At 11:14 a.m., Marsh came out of the deposition room and found Damon in the hallway. "She's done for today," Marsh said. "It'll take another 2 sessions to complete, but the core testimony is on the record." She looked at him with the careful assessment of a senior investigator evaluating a complicating variable. "The Kazan review." "Yes," he said. "The preliminary cross-referencing of the financial records with the Kazan operational timeline is consistent with what your database search uncovered. Vance's secondary operation was running against your operational infrastructure for approximately 14 months, which means my operation was compromised from inside Vance's office, which means the equipment irregularities and the approval chain anomalies that triggered the review originated in Vance's program, not yours." She paused. "You were operating in good faith against a compromised baseline. The review board will need to reckon with that." He looked at the ice pack in his hand. 2 people died. "I know. The review was supposed to answer for that. It still will, but the context changes what the answers mean." She met his eyes. "The decisions you made, the ones under question, they were made against a threat picture that had been altered by Vance's interference. That doesn't erase the outcomes, but it changes the accountability structure significantly." He absorbed that. It was the right answer, and also an incomplete answer, and probably the most honest thing she could say. The deposition room door opened. Emily came out. She looked, not relieved, not depleted exactly. Something in between, like someone who'd finished carrying something very heavy to the top of a hill and set it down and was now working out what to do with their hands. She looked at Damon. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's on the record," she said. "All of it?" "All of it." She exhaled slowly. "They have the drive, they have the testimony, they have the accountant, and apparently Rowe has his own documented evidence that cross-references with mine." She leaned against the wall. "Marsh said Vance is in federal custody." "He is. His legal team is going to—" "It doesn't matter," he said. "The financial documentation is forensically intact. You just gave 4 hours of testimony on the record. Rowe has independent corroboration. The DOJ has 8 months of their own parallel case building." He paused. "It's enough, Emily." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at him. "I know," she said. "I'm waiting to believe it." He understood that. There were things you knew and things you believed, and sometimes they were the same and sometimes they weren't, and sometimes you needed to let a little time pass for the knowing to become the believing. Marsh appeared again in the hallway with an agent behind her, and her expression had shifted, not urgency, but something that wanted attention. "We have a situation," she said. "Not a crisis. But you both need to hear it." The situation was this. Vance, in federal custody, in the presence of his legal team, had made a statement. Not a confession. His lawyers would never have permitted that. And Vance was not a man who'd spent 20 years in institutional cover operations without understanding the architecture of self-protection. But he'd made a statement through his counsel that referenced names. Specifically, he'd claimed that the Halcyon operation had not been a unilateral program, but had been run with the knowledge and authorization of 2 additional senior officers whose names appeared in documentation that Vance would produce in exchange for specific considerations. "He's offering a trade," Damon said. "He's threatening exposure," Marsh corrected, "which is different. He's not cooperating. He's warning us that if we move forward without a deal, he'll pull other people into this, and some of those people have the institutional standing to complicate the prosecution." "He's bluffing," Emily said. Marsh looked at her. "Possibly. Or he actually has documentation on 2 more senior officers, and he's been holding it as insurance for exactly this situation." She paused. "We don't know which yet." "Does it change the case against him?" Damon asked. "Not fundamentally. The financial documentation and the mission logs stand regardless of how many additional people were involved. If anything, more involvement makes the criminal enterprise larger, not smaller." Marsh was careful, professional. "But it does mean this investigation is likely to expand significantly, and it means Vance is going to make this as long and as loud as possible." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Good." Both Marsh and Damon looked at her. "Let it be loud," she said. "Let it be long. Let it be public and documented, and every name that should be exposed get exposed." She looked at Marsh. "My team died in that building because someone decided silence was easier than accountability. I don't want a quiet resolution. I want the full weight of it on the record." Marsh looked at her for a moment and then nodded. "Then that's what we'll build toward," she said. The afternoon moved fast after that. Emily was given a secure room in the building for the next 48 hours while the immediate threat assessment was evaluated. Vance in custody didn't mean his network was neutralized, and Marsh was appropriately cautious. Damon was briefed separately by the DoD Inspector General's representative for 2 hours, a process that was uncomfortable and thorough and ended with language he recognized as the beginning of a formal reversal on the Kazan review. At 6 p.m., Garrett Rowe walked into the building through the parking structure entrance, escorted by 2 agents, and Damon saw him for the first time in a hallway outside a conference room. He was in his early 40s, lean, with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to men who'd spent years in operational roles and then spent more years with nowhere to put it. They shook hands. There wasn't much to say. "The complaint you filed," Damon said, 4 years ago. "Disappeared in 3 days, Rowe said. "I was transferred inside 2 weeks. "Why didn't you go outside the chain?" Rowe looked at him with something between patience and the remnant of old frustration. "I tried, twice, through channels that should have been clean." A pause. "The second time my car was vandalized in the base parking lot. Nothing provable. Just a message." He looked at the conference room door. "So I watched and waited and documented everything I could reach from the outside. And then my database inquiry tripped your monitor. And then I watched Vance's people mobilize and I understood he'd found the original source." Rowe looked at him steadily. "You didn't know what you were walking into." "No," Damon said. "Neither did she, probably. Not the full shape of it." Damon thought about a Tuesday morning and a diner and a dog that pressed himself against a woman's legs. "No, not the full shape." At 8 p.m., Marsh called them both into a conference room with a screen at one end and a DOJ seal visible on a header document, and she told them what the forensic accountants had finalized in the preceding hours. The financial documentation from Emily's drive, cross-referenced against the DOJ's parallel case building and the corporate registry records Nora's contact had flagged, had traced the money movement through 4 shell companies to a disbursement point that connected to a single beneficial owner. Marcus Vance. Personally. Not an organization, not a program, not a classified fund with ambiguous authorization, a man, a set of accounts, and $22 million in diverted program funding over 7 years. The screen showed the chain, clean, documented, forensically authenticated. Emily looked at it. She'd known this. She'd known the shape of it for 4 years, but knowing and seeing a federal investigation presented on a screen with forensic accounting backing were different in a way she hadn't anticipated. It made the thing real in a different register. "He built a career on top of this," she said. "Yes," Marsh said. "He promoted, he accumulated influence. He positioned himself for another 6 years of service. Yes. On top of this. On top of their names." She was looking at the screen. "He is going to be held for all of it." It wasn't a question, but Marsh answered it like one. Every count we can build, we will, she said. Financial fraud, misuse of classified programs, obstruction, conspiracy, and the casualty documentation, the building fire, the operator team that opens wrongful death claims and potentially criminal homicide charges depending on the evidence threshold. She paused. This will not be a small case. Good, Emily said for the second time that day. At 10 p.m., Emily was alone in the secure room for the first time in 2 days. The room was small and clean and not comfortable, which was fine. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and held the drive in both hands. It had been copied and logged and returned to her because it was hers, and she thought about the weight of it. 4 years. Every careful move, every abandoned apartment, every name she hadn't used and place she hadn't stayed and person she hadn't contacted because contact was risk. Every morning in the harbor. Light diner, refilling coffee cups and listening to people talk about ordinary things and feeling the distance between the life she was performing and the life she was waiting to be allowed to have. She thought about Damon walking into that diner with a dog she recognized. She thought about the jaw pressure technique she'd used without thinking about it, the way muscle memory surfaced even when you'd been burying everything else. Her phone, the old one, the 2-year identity, had a message from a number she now recognized as Rose. It read, "Nora Kessick is safe." She walked out of the tree line at a property 2 miles east of her farm at 9 a.m. She's currently in the care of a contact in the county. She said to tell you she wants her secondary phone back. Emily read it twice. She set the drive on the small bedside table and lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. Down the hall, in another room, Damon was on the phone with the reviewing board officer who'd been managing the Kazan case. A conversation that was uncomfortable and specific and ended with the officer saying, carefully, that the board's preliminary findings would be revisited in light of new evidentiary context, which was the most lawyerly possible way of saying that the ground had shifted under the review and everyone knew it. He hung up and sat in the dark. His cheekbone ached. He was operating on 4 hours of fragmented sleep. He had a mandatory leave that had become the most consequential 2 weeks of the last decade, and somewhere in a federal building in Harwick, a woman who'd spent 4 years disappearing was on the record for the first time. He thought about what Marsh had said in the hallway. The decisions you made. They were made against a threat picture that had been altered. He thought about the 2 men from his unit who'd died. He thought about accountability, which he believed in genuinely, and how accountability was different from blame, and how sometimes those 2 things got tangled in ways that took time to separate. His phone buzzed. A message from Marsh's number. 3 lines. Vance's legal team filed an emergency motion at 9 p.m. claiming prosecutorial overreach and seeking immediate release on the grounds that evidence was obtained through unauthorized intelligence gathering by active-duty military personnel. The motion was denied at 9:47 p.m. He's not going anywhere. Damon read it 3 times. He set the phone down. Outside the building, the city of Harwick moved through its ordinary nighttime business, traffic lights cycling through empty intersections, a late restaurant closing up, someone walking a dog on the lit sidewalk below. Normal things. The kind of things that continued happening while everything else fell apart or got put back together. His phone buzzed again. Different number. Unknown. He answered. The voice on the other end was one he'd heard before. Briefings, command meetings, once in a helicopter in adverse weather conditions. A voice he associated with institutional authority and impenetrable composure. Brigadier General Marcus Vance, calling from a federal detention facility, which meant he'd either been given phone access through his legal team or he'd found a way around the monitoring protocol, and neither option was reassuring. "You should have stayed on your leave, Colonel," Vance said. Damon didn't move. "General, this is a complicated situation that you've made significantly more complicated by involving yourself." The voice was steady. Not desperate. Steady, measured, with the controlled patience of a man who'd navigated difficult terrain before and believed he could navigate this. "There are aspects of the Halcyon program that you don't understand, and that the DOJ investigation will not be equipped to contextualize without proper classification guidance. I think they'll manage. The other officers I referenced in my statement." A pause. "They're not protecting themselves. They're protecting programs that are still operational, Programs that exist for legitimate reasons that a financial crimes investigation is not equipped to evaluate. Another pause. If this goes the way you're letting it go, you will cause damage that extends well beyond me. You should make that argument to your lawyers, Damon said, in front of a judge. I'm making it to you now because you still have the ability to. I don't, Damon said. I don't have the ability to walk this back, and I wouldn't if I could. The woman whose team you killed has been on the record for 4 hours today. That's not something anyone in this building or outside it has the ability to alter. Silence on the line. You don't know what you've started, Vance said. I know what you started, Damon said. 4 years ago. In a building in a country that doesn't appear in your official record, with 6 people who trusted the chain of command and died for it. He kept his voice level. Whatever you're threatening, General, do it in court. That's the only conversation I'm available for. He ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he called Marsh's number and reported the contact in full, including the exact language, because it was evidence and evidence belonged on the record. Marsh listened without interrupting and then said, in the tone of someone who was tired but not surprised, "Thank you. We'll add it to the file." A pause. And Colonel? He's going to do that again. Different approach, different pressure point. He's very good at finding pressure points. I know, Damon said. Whatever he tries, you trust the process from here. He thought about that. Trust the process. He'd believed in the process his whole career, the chain, the oversight, the accountability structure that was supposed to catch the things that went wrong. The process had failed Emily for 4 years. It had failed Roe. It had failed the 6 people in the building. But right now, tonight, the process had denied Vance's emergency motion. The process had forensic accountants working through the night. The process had a woman's testimony on the record. I'll try, he said. He meant it. What he didn't say, because there was no reason to say it tonight, was the thing he'd been turning over since Marsh's briefing, the 2 additional names Vance had referenced, the officers whose documentation he claimed to hold, the implication that the network extended further and deeper than what Emily's drive contained. Emily had spent 4 years building a case that was now in federal hands. But if Vance wasn't the top of the structure, if there were 2 more levels above him, then the case Emily had built was the floor, and no one yet knew how high the ceiling was. The ceiling question got answered over the following 11 weeks, and the answer was worse than anyone had said aloud and less surprising than anyone admitted. The 2 additional officers Vance had referenced in his initial statement turned out to be real, documented, and considerably less protected than Vance had implied. His leverage over them had been premised on their silence, and his silence was no longer available for purchase. Within 72 hours of his arrest, both men retained separate legal counsel and began the specific process of institutional self-preservation that looked, from the outside, exactly like cooperation, and was, from the inside, exactly like panic. One submitted to voluntary interview. The other submitted a written statement through his attorneys that confirmed the existence of the Halcyon secondary operation and attributed primary direction to Vance, which was self-serving and also true, and the DOJ accepted both. The ceiling, it turned out, was Vance. The 2 officers above him on the organizational chart had known and had profited in smaller amounts and had looked away, but the architecture was his, the design was his, the fire was his. Knowing that didn't make it cleaner. It made it exact, which was different. Emily gave 2 more deposition sessions in the weeks that followed, both in Harwick, both recorded and documented and built on the foundation of the first. By the end of the 3rd session, Stern, the JAG officer who'd been present since the first morning, told her that the mission log authentication was complete and that the casualty documentation had been formally accepted as evidence in what was now a criminal investigation under 4 separate federal statutes. Stern said it with the measured professionalism of someone who dealt in the technical language of accountability for a living, but at the end of the session, she looked at Emily directly and said, "The names you gave us in the first session, we've entered them into the record as victims, not casualties. That distinction matters legally, and I wanted you to know we made it." Emily thanked her and waited until she was alone in the hallway before she stood still for a minute with her hand against the wall. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier and more necessary than relief. the specific weight of a thing being named correctly after years of being named wrong. The court-martial convening authority issued formal charges against Marcus Vance on a Thursday morning in late November. The charging document ran to 41 counts and was made public within 2 hours of filing, which was not standard practice and was, Emily understood when Marsh explained it, a deliberate decision by the DOJ to close the window on any remaining network pressure before it could be applied. The counts included conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, misappropriation of classified program funds, obstruction of military justice, unlawful destruction of government property, the building, logged formally as deliberate arson, and 6 counts of felony murder under federal statute, one for each member of Emily's unit who had died in that building. She read the document in the secure room, alone, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. 6 counts, 6 names, on a federal charging document that would become public record and would be searchable, and would exist in perpetuity in the way that official records existed, permanently, accessibly, in a form that couldn't be burned. She put the document down and looked at the wall and thought about the 6 people and what they'd been like. Not in the abstract, not as a unit, but specifically. Who drank too much coffee and who never drank enough. Who kept photographs on their bunk and who kept nothing personal because they'd learned to travel light. Who had family waiting and who had nobody waiting, and who had a dog at home that needed to be boarded every rotation. She remembered all of them. She'd been remembering them for 4 years. The difference now was that she didn't have to do it quietly. Vance's arraignment was not televised, but the coverage of it was immediate and extensive because the charging document was public, and the charges were the kind that drew attention from every national defense correspondent and 3 Senate Oversight Committee chairs who issued statements within hours of the filing. The statements were careful and political and said the right things without saying much, which was how institutional statements worked, but they existed on the record, and they created a context that made walking away from the case politically unfeasible for anyone who might have otherwise tried. Nora, reached by phone from a location she didn't specify, read the coverage and sent Emily a text that said, "Good. Now get some sleep." She was somewhere functional, Emily could tell from the background sounds on the one call they had. The operational hum of a place with servers running. She didn't ask where. Nora would surface when she was ready. Garrett Rowe's internal complaint, the one that had disappeared 4 years ago, was formally reopened by the DoD Inspector General's office and designated as a whistleblower document under federal protection. His transfer to Guam was reviewed and found to be retaliatory. He was offered reinstatement at his prior grade plus adjustment, and he spent 2 weeks deciding whether to take it. He called Emily once during those 2 weeks, not for advice, he was clear about that, but because he'd been sitting with the decision alone and wanted to say it out loud to someone who understood the specific texture of being offered back a thing you'd been separated from by force. "It's not the same job I had," he said, "the job I had ended 4 years ago." "No," she agreed. "It's a different job that looks similar from the outside." "Is that enough?" She thought about it. "I don't know. Is the work still worth doing?" A long pause. "Yes." "Then maybe that's the question that matters." He took the reinstatement. She thought it was the right call, and she also knew it would be hard in ways he couldn't fully anticipate yet, and she didn't say either thing because he hadn't asked. Damon's Kazan review was formally closed in December. The reviewing board issued a finding that acknowledged the compromised operational baseline created by Vance's secondary program and concluded that Damon's command decisions had been made in good faith against falsified intelligence and tampered logistics chains. The finding did not use the word exoneration because military review boards didn't use that word. It had its own language for the restoration of a record, a specific institutional vocabulary that said the same thing more carefully, but the effect was the same. He called her when he got the notification. "It's done," he said. She was in Harwich still, wrapping the final documentation sessions, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the secure room with the phone against her ear and heard something in his voice that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief and was probably the specific feeling of having a heavy judgment lifted when you'd been living under it long enough that its absence felt unfamiliar. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I'm not sure what to do with the extra weight." A pause. The 2 men from my unit. That doesn't change. No, she said. It doesn't. But I can carry it differently now, without the review sitting on top of it. He was quiet for a moment. That's something. That's a lot, she said. She meant it. The formal military honors ceremony for Emily's unit was held on a gray Tuesday in January at a ceremony facility in Harwick that was smaller than the occasion deserved and more honest for it. 6 names on a citation document that would be entered into the official record. Families who'd been told training accident for 4 years and were now being told something true, which was harder to absorb and more necessary to have. Emily stood at the back of the room during the ceremony, not because she'd been placed there, she could have stood anywhere, but because the front of the room was for the families, and this was their ceremony more than hers. She'd had her sessions in the deposition room. This was for the people who'd been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. Damon stood beside her, not because he'd been asked, because he'd driven 3 hours to be there and walked in without announcement and found her at the back of the room and stood next to her without needing to explain why. She didn't ask. When the names were read, she kept her breathing even and her eyes forward, and she was not okay, which was correct. There was no version of this that was okay, and she'd stopped trying to perform okay several weeks ago when she realized that the people around her in this process were not requiring it of her. Stern didn't require it. Marsh didn't require it. Damon, standing beside her now, was not requiring it. She was allowed to be not okay. That was also something. Also a lot. Axel was at Damon's left side because Damon had brought him, and at some point during the reading of the names, Axel moved and pressed himself against Emily's right leg, the way he had in the diner on a Tuesday morning that felt like it belonged to a different decade. She put her hand on his head. The trial of Marcus Vance began in March and lasted 9 weeks and was, as promised, not quiet and not small. His defense team was expensive and capable and pursued every available challenge with the thoroughness of people who were being paid to manufacture reasonable doubt out of a case that had very little room for it. They challenged the chain of custody on the financial documentation. They challenged Emily's credibility as a witness, her circumstances, her 4-year absence from official channels, the unconventional method by which the drive had been preserved. They made arguments that were professionally constructed and factually thin, and the jury, composed of people who had spent 9 weeks listening to forensic accountants and military investigators, and 2 cooperating officers describe in patient detail the architecture of a $22 million fraud built on top of 6 deaths, was not moved. Vance was convicted on 38 of the 41 counts. The 3 counts that didn't land were procedural, issues of jurisdiction and statutory interpretation that the defense had exploited successfully, and that Stern told Emily, afterward, would likely not affect the sentencing calculus in any significant way. 38 counts. Emily was in the courthouse when the verdict came in. She'd been brought in for the final days of testimony and had stayed. Marsh had offered her the option of hearing the verdict remotely, and she'd declined. She wanted to be in the room. She'd earned the right to be in the room. She heard the verdict read, and she sat with it. She'd expected to feel something large and sudden. What she felt instead was something that settled slowly, like sediment reaching the bottom of still water. Not triumph, not closure. She'd stopped believing in the cinematic version of closure sometime around year 2 of disappearing. What she felt was the specific, undramatic satisfaction of a thing being made true that had been false for too long. Vance was present for the reading, as required. He'd maintained the controlled composure of a senior officer through most of the trial. The posture and the expression of a man who'd spent 20 years performing institutional authority and couldn't fully turn it off, even in circumstances that called for something else. When the final count was read, the composure didn't break. It just became irrelevant. The expression stayed the same, and the situation around it had changed completely, and the gap between the two was its own verdict. He was remanded immediately. Emily watched the marshals take his arms, and she thought, this is what accountability looks like when it actually happens. Not cathartic, not cinematic, not the release she'd imagined in the dark of various temporary rooms over 4 years. Just a man being walked out of a room because a jury of ordinary people had listened to everything and decided that the evidence was sufficient and the law was applicable, and that was enough. It was enough. The sentencing, 6 weeks later, resulted in 23 years in federal confinement, permanent forfeiture of rank and military pension, and a formal notation of disgrace on his service record that would follow his name in every official context for the remainder of his life. The two cooperating officers received lesser sentences commensurate with their reduced culpability and cooperation, 5 years each with conditions, and were permanently barred from any future government or defense contractor employment. Vance's private assets, the accounts and properties traced through the shell company network, were seized under forfeiture statutes. $22 million returned to the program funds from which it had been taken. Not enough to undo anything. Enough to put a number on it. The defense contractor company, the defunct entity with no employees and a registered agent, was formally dissolved and its principals referred for separate state prosecution. Marsh sent Emily a summary document the morning after sentencing. At the bottom, in language that was not standard DOJ correspondence and was clearly added personally, it read, "You held this for 4 years when no one else would. The outcome belongs to you as much as it belongs to anyone." Emily read it once and set her phone down and went to make coffee and stood in the kitchen of the short-term apartment in Harwick. She'd been given a housing stipend during the proceedings, a small practical acknowledgement that participating in a 9-week federal trial required somewhere to sleep, and thought about what came next. That was new. Thinking about what came next as a question that had options. For 4 years, what comes next had been a matter of necessity. Next step, next cover, next temporary stop. The question had always been answered by circumstance before she could answer it herself. Now it wasn't. Her military service record was formally restored in April through the DoD Personnel Office, which processed the restoration with the bureaucratic neutrality it applied to all administrative actions and which made the document no less significant for being unadorned. Her nursing licenses, which had lapsed under the name and circumstances of her disappeared identity, were reinstated through an expedited process that Stern's office had facilitated. Not a favor, Stern had been clear about that, but a recognition that the lapse had been involuntary and circumstantially caused. The civilian honor came through a separate process, a formal commendation from the Secretary of Defense's office for civilian service rendered under extraordinary circumstances, specifically for the preservation and delivery of evidence critical to a major federal prosecution. The language of the commendation was careful and institutional, as that language always was. What it said, in the vocabulary of official recognition, was that the work she'd done mattered, and that the people who'd failed to protect her the first time were on record acknowledging that failure. It wasn't an apology. Institutions didn't apologize in that register. But it was acknowledgement, which was what the record required, and what she'd been building toward. Damon was present when the commendation was presented, at a small, unphotographed ceremony in a conference room at the Harwick Federal Building. He stood at the side of the room in civilian clothes. When it was over and the officials had said their careful words and left, he walked over and looked at the document in her hands. "Not bad for a waitress," he said. She looked at him. "That's what you said in the diner," he said. "When I asked you what you did, you said you were a waitress." "I was a waitress." "Yeah." He held her gaze. "You were also everything else, at the same time, without anyone seeing it." She thought about that. About the 2 years at Harbor Light Diner, refilling cups, clearing tables, performing ordinary. She'd been good at it. She'd been genuinely good at it. And that wasn't a nothing thing, and she'd stopped being ashamed of it somewhere around the 3rd deposition session, when she realized that surviving with dignity was its own form of skill. "I liked the job," she said. "That's the thing no one asks about. I actually liked it." He looked slightly surprised. "I was good at reading people, at understanding what they needed before they asked, at being useful in a room." She looked at the commendation and set it on the table. "Turns out that's not so different from trauma medicine. The specific skills transfer more than you'd think." "Where are you going to use them next?" he asked. She'd been thinking about this. The Voss Recovery and Rehabilitation Center opened in Stone Harbor on a Friday in September, which was a better month for openings on the northeastern coast than most. Cool enough to be comfortable, warm enough that the bay was still navigable, the light doing the particular thing it did in early fall when it sat low and amber over the water and made everything look like it had been considered. The building was a converted maritime facility, wide floors, high ceilings, large windows that looked east over the water, that had sat empty for 3 years and been acquired through a combination of the seized asset recovery funds that had been directed into a veterans rehabilitation grant program and private donations from sources she'd spent 4 months building. The center provided residential rehabilitation for wounded veterans and long-term care and recovery facilities for retired military working dogs. Both populations, she'd argued in her grant proposal, had the same fundamental need, somewhere that understood their specific history and didn't require them to translate it into language civilians could manage. The proposal had been approved by 3 separate grant committees in 60 days, which was not how grant approval normally worked, and was a direct consequence of the federal commendation and the name recognition that came with a case that had run in every national outlet for 9 weeks. She hadn't wanted the attention. She'd accepted that it was useful. The dog's wing occupied the ground floor and the garden space behind the building. On the opening day, there were 4 dogs in residence. Retired military working dogs who'd aged out of service and whose handlers were not able to provide continued care for various reasons. A shepherd mix named Cove, a Belgian Malinois named Reese who limped from an old injury but moved faster than anyone expected. 2 other dogs whose names she knew and whose individual needs she'd already cataloged. Axel was not in residence. Axel lived with Damon, who had returned to active duty after the Kazan review was formally closed, and had, 3 months after that, submitted voluntary separation papers instead. Not because the institution had failed him, though it had, but because he'd spent 11 months on mandatory leave discovering that the things he'd been doing instead of working were not supplementary to a life, but were, increasingly, the life itself. He was consulting now, formal and informal, the specific kind of consulting that people with his clearance and his operational background did when they left and the institution still needed their knowledge without their chain of command complications. He came to the opening. He brought Axel. He also brought Nora, who had surfaced publicly in early summer and who had accepted a formal role as an independent security consultant to Marsh's DOJ unit, a role that was unconventional and that Marsh had apparently argued for with considerable energy. Nora arrived at the opening with the same narrow-eyed assessment she applied to all environments and walked through the building once before she said anything. "It'll work," she said. "The layout is good. The dogs will like the East Garden." Coming from Nora, that was a speech. Roe couldn't make the opening. He was on assignment, the kind he didn't specify. But he sent a message that arrived at 7 a.m. The work matters. The place matters. You matter. 3 sentences. She appreciated the economy of it. There were about 40 people at the opening, which was intentionally small. Families of the unit members who died were represented. She'd written to each of them personally after the sentencing, and 3 had responded, and 2 of those had come today. She hadn't known what those conversations would be like, and she still didn't have clean language for them, because there was no clean language. What there was honesty, which turned out to be the only currency that worked. The families didn't need her to explain or justify or perform resolution. They needed to know that someone who had been there was still here, still holding it, still making it mean something beyond the official record. That was what she could offer. It wasn't nothing. The ceremony was short because she'd planned it to be short, a brief account of the center's purpose. The names of her team members read into the occasion, the same way they'd been read at the honors ceremony, because they deserved to be named in the context of something being built, not only in the context of what had been lost. A moment of acknowledgement for the veterans and the dogs who would come through these doors. Then coffee and food and the business of people actually looking at the building. Damon found her near the east-facing windows, where the bay was visible and the morning light was doing the amber thing it did. Axel was at his side, and Axel looked at her with the same steady recognition he'd had since the diner, the same wordless continuity of a creature who didn't process time the way humans did and didn't understand why she'd been gone and didn't require an explanation. "How does it feel?" Damon asked. She looked at the room, the people in it, the dogs in the far end of the garden, visible through the glass. The names on the wall, she'd had them put there, the 6 names, in a simple format that didn't aestheticize the loss but simply stated it. "Like something that should have happened sooner," she said, "and also like something that couldn't have happened any other way. That's 2 things. Most true things are 2 things at once." He was quiet for a moment. The diner in Merritt, Cove. It's been closed for a month. The owner's retired. I heard. The building's for lease. He was looking at the bay. Decent coffee location. She looked at him. I have a rehabilitation center to run. I know. A pause. I'm not suggesting you go back. He looked at her. I'm just saying, it was a good diner. She thought about the Harbor Light diner, the pale blue uniform, the laminated menus, the old men at the window table, and the way the morning light came through the fogged glass in winter, and the weight of a coffee pot held in a hand that had done much harder things. It was a good diner, she agreed. She'd spent 4 years making herself small enough to be invisible, and the smallness had kept her alive, and it had also been genuine. The work had been real, the people had been real, the cups of coffee had been real. She hadn't just been waiting. She'd been living, carefully, in the margins of a life she couldn't fully claim. Now she could claim it. The difference wasn't triumph, it was permission. The specific permission that came from the record being corrected and the names being entered, and the man who'd built his career on silence, now sitting in federal confinement while the things he'd tried to bury were permanently public. It was permission to be the whole thing at once: the nurse, the witness, the woman who'd survived, the person who'd built something from it. Not one after the other in careful sequence, all of it, simultaneously, without apology. Axel pressed his nose against her hand. She looked down at him. 7 years old, retired from operational service, arthritis beginning in his left rear haunch. The same one she'd treated years ago, in a facility that no longer officially existed. He looked back at her with the patient, complete attention that dogs brought to the people they'd chosen. And he didn't know about the charging documents or the 38 counts or the commendation in a folder in her office. He just knew her. He'd known her from the moment she walked toward his table in a diner with a coffee pot. Some things, it turned out, were harder to erase than records. She scratched behind his ear. Okay, she said quietly. To him. To the room. To no one in particular and everyone at once. The center was open. The names were on the wall. The people who needed it would come, and she would be here. And the work would be harder than anything she'd planned for, and also exactly the right work. And she would do it imperfectly, with full knowledge of her own limitations, and that would be enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that you built instead of found. She'd learned the difference, finally, between hiding your strength to survive and holding it quietly because the moment for it hadn't arrived yet. The diner had taught her that. 4 years of patience had taught her that. Axel, pressing himself against her legs on a Tuesday morning in front of a room full of strangers, had taught her that. Strength that didn't demand to be seen was still strength. It just waited for the right door.